Hey y'all, it's entry number 51 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Christian McCaffrey, running back, Carolina Panthers. We'll start with the positives with Christian McCaffrey's fantasy profile. Unreal fantasy ceiling. If you are purely chasing upside, it's hard to beat Christian McCaffrey in fantasy drafts. He's averaged an insane 113.8 yards per scrimmage per game over the course of his career, according to Pro Football Reference. He scored 20 or more fantasy points in 18 of his last 26 games, according to fantasy data. He had one of the greatest fantasy seasons ever during the 2019 season, where he averaged 22.2 fantasy points per game in standard, 25.8 fantasy points per game in half PPR formats, and 29.5 fantasy points per game in full PPR formats. The next thing I really like about Christian McCaffrey's fantasy profile is his slightly improved supporting cast from 2021. The Carolina Panthers made the move to trade for quarterback Baker Mayfield and draft Matt Corral this offseason to make sure they have better quarterback play than what Sam Darnold and Cam Newton gave the team last year. The offensive line is projected to be a little better this year after finishing the 2021 season ranked as the 31st best offensive line in the league according to Pro Football Focus. They are projected to have new starters at 4 of the 5 starting positions. And after all these moves, the Carolina Panthers offensive line is projected to be the 24th best offensive line in the league in 2022, according to Pro Football Focus. Is this a great offense? No, but by being at least a little better, it will make it easier for McCaffrey to score fantasy points than it was last year. The last major thing I really like about Christian McCaffrey's fantasy profile is his lack of competition and bell cow workload. Christian McCaffrey has been a bell cow back for the majority of his career, with a career average of 19.6 touches per game according to Pro Football Reference. Looking at the depth chart, it's extremely likely that McCaffrey will once again be a bell cow as long as he's healthy, as Chuba Hubbard, Donta Foreman, and Spencer Brown aren't exactly top-tier backups. Having a guy that may see a massive workload makes McCaffrey a more intriguing bet in fantasy leagues for the 2022 season. Moving on to some of the concerns with Christian McCaffrey's fantasy profile. Injuries. It's no secret that Christian McCaffrey has struggled with injuries the past couple of seasons. His injury history the last couple of years includes a right ankle sprain, a shoulder AC joint sprain, a thigh glute strain, a hamstring strain, and a left ankle sprain, and his injury risk is listed as high risk according to draft charts. He's played in 58 of a possible 81 career regular season games, and just 10 of the last 33 regular season games for the Carolina Panthers the last 2 years. Availability is an important ability, and nowadays McCaffrey seems to be on the lower end of the spectrum in this department among early round picks. The next major concern I have with Christian McCaffrey's fantasy profile is that the play calling has changed from his peak dominance. It's been a while since we've seen Christian McCaffrey play a full season, and the last time we saw him truly dominate was in the 2019 season when he had Norv and Scott Turner serving as his primary play callers, Norv for the first 12 games and Scott for the last 4 games. Now, he's playing in Matt Rule and Ben McAdoo's offense, and both of those guys haven't had quite as friendly a running back usage track record as Norv Turner and Scott Turner did, particularly with utilizing backs in the passing game. Because of this, there's a good chance that his fantasy ceiling is slightly lower, still very high, than what we saw in 2019. The last concern I have with Christian McCaffrey's fantasy profile is his team's offense. We talked about how the Carolina Panthers offensive supporting cast should be a little better this year, but it's important to remember where they are starting from. During the 2021 season, the Panthers offense ranked 30th in total yards per game with 298.9, and 29th in points per game with 17.9 according to ESPN. Even with the improvements, this is still likely a bottom half of the league offense, which may impact McCaffrey's fantasy totals. Some additional thoughts on Christian McCaffrey's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Christian McCaffrey finished as the RB44 in standard, with 90.5 total fantasy points and 12.9 fantasy points per game, the RB39 in half PPR formats, with 109.0 total fantasy points and 15.6 fantasy points per game, and the RB38 in full PPR formats, with 127.5 total fantasy points and 18.2 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Christian McCaffrey had 1 out of 7 games with 0 to 4.9 fantasy points, 1 out of 7 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 7 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 0 out of 7 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 4 out of 7 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. During the 2020 season, in half PPR formats, Christian McCaffrey scored at least 20 fantasy points in all 3 of his games according to fantasy data. During the 2019 season, in half PPR formats, Christian McCaffrey had 1 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 25 to 30 fantasy points, and 4 out of 16 games with over 30 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Christian McCaffrey averaged 22.2 fantasy points per game in standard, 25.8 fantasy points per game in half PPR, and 29.5 fantasy points per game in PPR formats during the 2019 season. In addition, he averaged 30.1 fantasy points per game in full PPR formats during the 2020 season. Yards per touch and efficiency. Christian McCaffrey averaged 5.5 yards per touch in 2017, the 7th best among running backs, 6.0 yards per touch in 2018, the 7th best among running backs, 5.9 yards per touch in 2019, the 6th best among running backs, 4.9 yards per touch in 2020, and 5.8 yards per touch in 2021, the 5th best among running backs according to Player Profiler. He's clearly very efficient, which is why he gets the ball so much. Personal opinion. Christian McCaffrey is currently going off the board as RB2 about pick 5 overall on ESPN and RB5 about pick 6 overall on Yahoo. This seems about right. I think he belongs somewhere in the RB2 to RB4 range for this year, depending on the scoring format, but could certainly understand someone ranking him first overall. If you're a bit of a gambler and someone who is chasing upside at first overall pick, you're likely going with Christian McCaffrey, because if he plays 75% or more of the games this season at the per game levels that we've seen from him the past few years, your team should make the fantasy playoffs and have a shot to win it all. If you're someone who wants a running back but is still chasing safety at first overall, you're likely going with Jonathan Taylor. If you're someone that frequently visits our fantasy football, you're likely going to be drafting Josh Gordon at first overall. For me, I have Christian McCaffrey ranked as the RB2 behind Jonathan Taylor, but as a top 4 pick overall. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Christian McCaffrey's My Cause My Cleats in 2021 was for the Christian McCaffrey Foundation, which according to their website shows up for our servicemen and women, veterans, and military families to support them where their need is greatest. By responding to the most pressing needs and challenges of military families, we will best serve those who serve us. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.